I want to start by thanking Rosie, Clark, and Noreen so much for being here and for opening up this space. And I know it might sound a little bit silly, but for being women who are in the positions that they're in, because I felt safe when they asked me if there was anything on my mind that I wanted to talk about, to say yes, well, as a matter of fact, there is something that I want to talk about. And I don't think that I would have felt comfortable doing that, for better or worse, were they not here. And I also want to call out, just briefly, Aspen Mattis, who is in the back. She's the author of Girl in the Woods. Many of you might be familiar with her memoir about being raped the second night of her freshman year in college. It's an extraordinary book, and I recommend checking it out. She was one of my students who has been telling me for years, Bonnie, you have this story, and like it's burning in you, it's eating you alive, you have to tell it. And every time she tells me this, I'm like, yeah, I'll tell it someday. But every time she said that, I was like, she's crazy, I'm never gonna do it. And then I don't know what it was, if it was a postpartum hormonal rush or if it was just suddenly having a bigger family. I woke up one night, could not sleep until I started typing this stuff out. And I called Aspen in the morning and was like, my hands are shaking. How do you do this? I can't even type. My hands are shaking. And she said, just keep going. I promise you it will feel better when you get it out. So this is a summary for sure, but it's clearing my throat a little bit, and I'm particularly indebted to Aspen. When I was working on my MFA, I had a predatory, exploitative, and violent teacher who convinced me he loved me, told me we were going to move to Europe together and eventually marry, who called me names, hit me, locked me in a closet, cut me with glass, and toward the end of the relationship forced me, despite my tears and protests, to undress and have sex with him. He did the undressing. I was 22 when I met him. He was older than my parents. He humiliated me so thoroughly in every imaginable way that memories of the time over a decade later still stop me in my tracks. He is a much beloved and celebrated storyteller, a teacher, a mentor, a master of the craft. He wouldn't let me go to the bathroom by myself. He made fun of me and called me piggy whenever I ate anything, no matter how small the bite, until I called myself piggy. This man repeatedly told me that whenever in my life I'd hear the sound of my own breath, that would be him whispering to me. Can you imagine that? When I'm walking, running, cooking, kissing my babies, lying in bed next to my husband. He made me promise never to write about him. It's a promise I've broken many times, most explicitly here tonight. When I left that school, I went on to get a PhD. One of my teachers asked me to attend a prestigious writing conference with him, not as a fellow or scholar, though I'd already completed 2 master's degrees and published half a dozen stories by this time, but to be his nanny. Later, he told me my first draft of Lamb was, quote, so good it made him want to sleep with me, end quote. Having already been down this road, I reported him, removed him from my committee, and finished the PhD without his assistance. And I was really sorry to do so because he was truly an amazing teacher, and again, a much beloved and celebrated storyteller. At the time, the university determined that nothing he had done had been sexual harassment, but rather, as he had explained to them, just his way of complimenting and supporting me. After that, I was awarded a teaching fellowship at a small competitive college where, in a friendly conversation about how I was doing after a separation from my husband, I confided in a colleague that even though I was on my own, I still thought I wanted to have children and was considering the ways as a woman to do that, adoption, IVF, etc. He advised me to ask the wife of a faculty creative writing professor if I could, quote, borrow him and, quote, fuck him a little. We were in a car on the way to the airport to pick up a visiting writer, a real big shot, I can tell you, a much beloved and celebrated storyteller. So I couldn't walk away. Smiling politely, I told my colleague he couldn't talk to me that way, to which he responded with this still baffling, nonsensical, what? You know what's up. The following week, in front of a class of our students, he told me, suck on this, Bonnie. I just sat there. It was one of my students afterward who told me I should have stood up and walked out. All of these men were married with children. I continued to witness their success and public adoration and celebration not only of their work, but also of them personally as teachers and leaders. Sometimes I can barely write or read because after all, they were my teachers and their voices of guidance are now indelibly part of the process for me. I don't have much interest anymore in teaching creative writing. I don't want to go to writing conferences or retreats or readings or celebrations of the literary arts. I'm loath to network, to be on social media, to review other people's work, make friends who are writers, male or female. For one thing, I don't know what stories, true or untrue, people have heard about me. Something I've learned about narcissistic people through these experiences is that they can't control you. They'll try to control the way people see you. I'm not here to try to find my way to forgiveness. It's been years and years, and I've already personally forgiven these men and the institutions and colleagues who enabled them and or who looked the other way. When I followed up with one of my professor's colleagues, they told me it would have, quote, taken tremendous bravery for any of them to have spoken up, end quote. And I'm not here to seek revenge. I don't wish anyone harm. In fact, if you think you can guess any of the men I'm describing, please know that each of them has a thick red beard. That's for my lawyers. I'm here because everyone I love, my friends, my family, my wonderful life partner, now my children, are all victims of these men as long as I remain so. And I'm here because some of you have similar stories eating you alive. Some of you may even share them with the same men. As a matter of fact, though I have no reason to believe the aforementioned abusive teacher of mine was violent with anyone else, you'd be surprised how many of your stories I know. The details of your time together, the tears shed, the words you uttered. I had the unusual opportunity to hear from and of many of the letters you've given him over the decades. Letters that were stacked in a box in the closet off his garage, the same garage closet he locked me in once. Most of you signed your names. One of you always wrote to him in green ink and never signed your name. That was wise. I wish I'd never signed mine. I wonder how many of the doting emails I sent him he has still saved. I saved every single one of his and copied them and shared the files with everyone in my immediate family. In that garage closet he locked me in, I sat next to your letters, stacked together in a box from the previous decades. For how many hours? An hour, two, without knowing they were there. I sat dutifully with my arms around my knees, waiting for him to let me out, whereupon I'm sure I did everything he asked me to. It was only a few months ago my big sister was recalling an abusive relationship in high school. She told me she'd been locked in a closet. What? I asked her frankly. You're not supposed to be locked in a closet? Because I was also locked in a closet. No, she told me very sadly, you're not supposed to be locked in a closet. What I really want to say tonight is that all of these things happened to me, that none of it was okay, that I didn't deserve any of it, and that I have nothing to be ashamed of. But the truth is, it has all diminished me, silenced me, terrified me, and shamed me. I see so many writers, male and female, pictured with these men on social media. Why would anyone believe me? Who am I? What do I matter in comparison with them? But we know, don't we, that men, especially those in positions of power, try to hurt, tame, and control what they fear. And that women individually and especially together are tremendously powerful. It is so clear, isn't it clear, on so many different counts today, that the world needs us to come together and speak up and do. Thank you so much for being here and bearing witness.
I just want to say that I think one of the most important things that we can do as men and as women in our environment is to make safe spaces insofar as we can, and spaces where women feel comfortable speaking. And so I just want to, rather than asking my planned first question, to open the discussion to the panel for your reactions and thoughts. And Amy, do you want to start?
In response to what you just read?
Yeah, I wonder if you want to respond to that from your own experience or even from the environment you're functioning in now and how it can help.
Is there a way to turn this on? Is this on?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you. I mean, sadly, I'm listening and I'm not even trying to put names to who, because the problem with this story is that the story is so familiar. I don't doubt that there's any woman in the room who has not got a similar story. I mean, we at VITA have a section called Reports from the Field, where women are invited to write about such experiences. You can write anonymously, you can write as yourself. And we have historically said if you want to name names, as long as you have some sort of documentation. And recently, actually, we let an anonymous group of women name someone and give their stories. We just gave them the platform and said, we trust you. And this got so much flack because there's so much kickback in the culture that says women's voices on their own terms are not valid. And, you know, of course, as we know, the legal apparatus is designed that way to question, what did you do? And you wrote him letters, and, you know, you were in this relationship with him. Why didn't you do anything? I mean, it's just, women are on trial so much. So I guess I feel immense sympathy and tremendous anger, and that's part of why I've worked so hard to make VITA the platform that it is, so that women can be heard on their own terms, on our own terms. And I guess that's what my position on this right now.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, it's unfortunate, the part that for me, because we have spoken about having some similar experiences, and the part that especially gets me is, of course, that the classroom is no longer really a safe space, and the academic environments are such breeding grounds for this behavior. I've been, you know, teaching pretty much nonstop for the last 14 years, and I've been appalled as an educator, as a colleague, but also as a woman on these campuses too. So there's like so many different layers of this. I mean, just last week I was telling colleagues that if I hear about another male professor dating a student, I don't know what I'll do. I can't believe that's legal. That's an abuse of power, even though it's legal. That should not be allowed. One day it won't be. But the fact is, professors can date students. I mean, if they're over 18, it's fine. I guess some schools say they can't be your student in that semester, so they wait a semester.
It was not legal at the school I was at, and during any semester, and I consider the whole degree null and void.
Yeah. It's this is how old boys clubs works, and this is why you have professors who have this behavior, because it's like a candy factory. Every semester there's new students, so it's very ideal for someone who has this tendency to be a predator. So it's horrible. I mean, I do think, you know, we're talking about sexism, and now we're talking about, you know, sexual abuse and also, you know, rape and all sorts of things, but I do think there is a way in which the literary world is less safe for me than some of the other worlds that I'm in, and I think some of it has to do with some of the old boys club mentalities. The fact that there may be people here who know me less as a novelist or a journalist than someone who was like cyber attacked by a book blogger a few years ago. I mean, that's what I'm known for the novelist. It's crazy. I go to events like, oh, I remember a male colleague introduced me to one of his friends, another writer was visiting campus, and the guy said, oh no, you're the cyber girl. And I said, no, I'm not the cyber. And I'm very good. I've always had issues with men in a way, so I enjoy the opportunity to destroy men when I can. So I was like, no, and you need a timeout for that comment. But it's you know, I was attacked in a way online that had everything to do with being a woman. The nature of the attack was sexual. He chose to give information about someone who had online photos, like naked photos of me that were not consensual. Someone had taken photos of me when I was sleeping. Another writer in our community, also beloved and celebrated, and in fact married to a prominent feminist who might not know the details of this. So this is an incestuous small family. Here we're in New York, in the center of New York, and this is all very tied. Everybody's tied. Many of us are, I don't know who it is, but I'm sure many of us have very close degrees of
West Coast.
Yeah, we
not New York.
It's an easy network. So this is, I think, a very important topic that never gets old.
I just want to add, one thing that you said, Bonnie, that stuck out was the idea, and I talk about this a lot too. I feel like I always say I've made it when men express this rage. I think this idea that they're fearful, and so they try to control. I think that we can see right now in the culture around us, in the political thing that's going on, through the reports from the field that are coming out, we can see that there are a lot of women who are feeling supported despite the blowback and the you know, whatever you want to call it. What did Susan Flutie call it? I can't remember. She wrote a whole book on it. Yes, despite the backlash. I'm thinking post black presidential backlash at this point. But though we're hearing more stories in the lit world, I think it's because there are more men speaking out and supporting women, and there are more women who are coming together and saying, fuck this, we're gonna have our stories told, and we expect you to say, we did something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so that awareness is just motivating women, I think, at this point to tell our stories and just not let it, you know.
Yeah, eventually it doesn't matter anymore what anyone's going to
Yeah,
say. You
it's-
just have
exactly.
to tell it.
Davina, did you want to add?
No, thank you, Bonnie, for that. And it's interesting, the first thing I thought as I was hearing you speak was of the Vita space that was given to that group of women. And I remember sitting and reading those, and it just was like, you know, more and more and more. And it was incontestable, you know. But it's interesting for me, I came, you know, to the literary world, you know, at age 40. So I kind of had lived a bunch. I worked in social change for 15 years. And the most overt, you know, sexist experience that I had was in that world. And it's very much there too, you know, in certain ways, but it was a very kind of confrontational, because I finally confronted it, and so it kind of was a very you know, acute, you know, situation. But I did come to the literary world with a bit of rose-tinted glasses, because to me it was the land of ideas, and I just thought, like, how can, you know, I just assumed this kind of progressivism. But one of the things that I think there's this lawlessness that's underneath it, whether it's in the university setting, whether it's kind of, you know, seems above all of these things, which in turn allows, you know, and kind of tacitly permits, you know, this stuff. You know, and so on the surface, what is said versus what is done, there's like this big dichotomy. And I must say that, you know, I wasn't naive for my years, being a native New Yorker, and, you know, like, I consider myself this kind of great person, but I was naive coming to it. And as I observed more and more, and as I got privy to conversations that were happening behind closed doors, or when the mics are off, or, you know, I was kind of like, you know, taken aback.
Yeah.
And I think it's been shocking to all of us, or it was shocking to me, to see on the national political stage the absolute legitimization of behavior that is reprehensible, that the idea of locker room talk and boys will be boys was met, you know, with some outrage, but considered a legitimate thing by 40% of Americans to say on the national stage was pretty shocking to me. And so raised the question for me about how systemic sexism is still thriving in this country, and then especially how it operates in the literary world. And this, for me, has been a real conundrum, because I know so many women at very high levels in the publishing world, and they're great women, and they've worked really hard and fought really hard to be in the positions they're in. And yet, at the same time, I can admire them for their work and the positions they've achieved. I can't help noticing the kind of bias that exists in that world. And so that's a very difficult pill for me to swallow. And I wondered what your experiences of that have been as writers. And many of you operate in multiple spheres, some in fiction or only in the world of journalism, but I wonder how you have encountered that kind of systemic unconscious, and how women in positions of power have maybe internalized that narrative about themselves and about other women. So I just wanted to throw open that question in the literary world.
Well, I'll just say one thing, because I was thinking about this very issue, especially given my piece is about being in a workshop with all women and a women instructor. So I think that, depending on whichever survey, you look at least on the publishing side, it's majority women. And so, I mean, having come to the literary world from working at a racial justice organization, after Obama got elected, and so we all knew in that organization that the country is not post-racial, and so similarly, it's a similar scenario. But it's not the numbers are important, but it's not a numbers game. It's a culture game and a power game. And so, I do really appreciate what Claire May Watkins explicitly said about the internalized patriarchy and misogyny, and so how those things have to be kind of really dealt with and really shed light on, and it's not an end thing, it's an ongoing process, so that because otherwise it's still the same system, even if there's different bodies in it. And that's not to take away from, as you mentioned, the moves that have been made, but it really does speak to the systemic nature.
I'll add on to that a little bit, building on what you're talking about. I don't think I'm saying anything that you wouldn't say. I don't know if all of you are familiar with the Vita count, which we are looking at the numbers in terms of just really basic numbers, the gender disparity in publishing. We've broadened our count, we call it the Vita count, we've broadened our count over the last couple of years to look at race and sexual orientation and a few other things. We started a disability count, etc. But the reason we're doing that is because it's easy to discount the numbers and, this doesn't tell you anything because it is cultural, it is systemic. But it does give us some evidence to point at and say, well, look, these numbers are happening. These women, white women, cis white women who are heterosexual, whatever, are being published in much greater numbers than proportionate to the population. And I think that the tie-in, there's this tie-in. So when we're looking at women, we say, well, women are getting more equality in the, or not more equality, but more access and positions of power and stuff. The problem is it's actually white women. So the tie-in is that, what you're speaking to is this idea that, I guess, there is this built-in in the she's referring to her essay that was published in Vita. This built-in inherent, and you see this with a lot of Trump supporter women who fascinate me. This inherent, well, if I do what I'm supposed to do in the patriarchy, I'll get my reward. But this is also a white woman's reward, and it means access to certain things and protections and mobility and this sort of thing. So it's easy to shut other women of color down and say, so you see this coded a lot actually in the literary world. A lot of the criticisms we get for the count, we advocate for women of color to be published, and then we're told, well, you can't create quotas, and well, actually you can, but that's beside the point. You can't look at the numbers, it doesn't really speak to the writing, and then you start hearing the code come in that you also hear in sort of the political world. You hear the code of we look at the quality and we look at the what's going on in the writing. We can't make writers of color. It's as though the underlying premise of this is that there aren't writers of color writing with legitimate voices and in any valid ways, that only, and you hear the criticisms of this, it starts to encroach these ideas of censorship. Well, censorship, I talk to my students all the time about this, there's no absolute freedom of speech. You have platforms and you have means, and so who are you giving the mics to? Whose value systems are you selling and putting out there and supporting and promoting? And typically it's one that reflects the history of the country, which is one of white supremacy. So this is why a lot of white women are, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but there's a lot of code going on in the criticisms that we get when we look at these things, these aspects.
This notion of quality has been a defensive weapon that's been wielded for a long time. And I just want to, side note for the audience, we do 2 programs here that I'm very proud of, our Emerging Writer Fellowships and our First Novel Prize. I'd like you all to go to our website. The Emerging Writers Fellowship is blind judged. Every entry is assigned a number, and look at the people who have won fellowships this year. And I think you'll see where really, really exciting work is happening in America right now. And I think you'll also look at who the shortlisted writers are for our First Novel Prize. And these 2 things completely debunk the notion that you can find work of quality outside of white communities in America. It's just an absolutely ridiculous notion. And one other thing I wanted to add is that I do think that the disturbing thing in publishing is not only the lack of women of color, but also the lack of men of color. I can count on one hand the men of color in positions of power in the publishing world. I think there are 4 that I know.
Though I will
So-
say that the men I talked about did not all have red beards, or the ability to grow a red beard.
Yes, I understand that. So, so I just wanted to interject that because for so long we've been hearing this just argument about quality that I think is so stern.
Well, I think we also undermine ourselves with that sometimes too, because the issue of value is an interesting one too, because look, there's nothing objective in what we do, right? So that explains why there are some old systems put into play of support networks like the Boys Club I was talking about. But I know for a long time I just accepted that my value was less than a white male colleague of mine, and I had to find clever ways to work myself around that. And so I remember an experience at a few years ago. I was at an Australian book festival. As an American author, when you're sent to Australia, it's a good sign. You get treated very well. You make a lot of money there when you do the book festival circuit. And so I had just, while I was there, I sold my 3rd book. And my 3rd book, the advances on these 3 books altogether put me at $70,000. That's over a decade's worth of work, if you want to do the math on that. And these are all major publishers, by the way. I have not been published by obscure indie presses. These are all places you've heard of. The last one being HarperCollins, which I love, but that was for my advances. And I had a sort of fling with a debut novelist, a male writer exactly my age, a little less educated than me, but he had a big debut, and he was asking me for help, and I was helping him with publicity. I was helping him. He said, "Will you do an event with me in McNally Jackson? We'll introduce the book." I said I'd help him. I did all sorts of work. I helped edit a manuscript of his, and his debut novel advance was $500,000. So there's no need why in the same, that I'm in an imprint of the same publishing house. There's no reason why my first novel would have had an advance of $20,000 and his would be $500,000. That's just, the scale is absurd. I was reviewed, full Sunday New York Times book review. The New Yorker reviewed me. I was NPR. I had all those things, so I wasn't an underdog in any way. If you look me up, there's plenty of publicity press. But yet, I accepted that there's a difference in value, and I became immune to that. And I think this is very common, and I try to really empower. That's my only way now with students, with the young women. I give them extra to tell them that they have to feel strong, because this sort of thing will exist, and they'll internalize it.
I have an interesting sort of different reaction to similar sort of forces operating on my so-called writing career, and that is, I know that there's a lot of talk right now about whether people should be paid and how much they should be paid, and I just sort of, with apologies to my agent, allowed in my heart that this is sort of an arduous hobby, and I'm not going to get paid for it, and in fact, I might not come public with any work anymore. Why should I? I write because I love it and it matters to me. And I don't by this mean like I'm like Emily Dickinson and I'm gonna put it all in a trunk. But something sort of like that. Like I'm obviously not doing it for reviews, of which I get none. I'm not doing it for money. I'm not doing it for, status or chatter of the world, because I know that doesn't matter. Every spiritual and secular book about how to live has said for thousands and thousands of years not to be motivated by these things. And so why not let go? So that's kind of where I am right now.
Does anyone have an answer to that? Why not let go?
Because we deserve recognition and support, and our stories and our voices are as legitimate. And I mean, the disparity is absolutely absurd. And it's, again, this is not an unfamiliar story. It's just, again, it's the code. The objective means white male. I mean, I recently wrote something very small for PEN America, as she said, about the Bob Dylan thing, and it's just like yet another white male who's a billionaire, who's gotten as many accolades as he needs as a songwriter, gets the Nobel Prize for Literature. And we both received so much flack.
One same guy.
Yeah, we got actually a form email. And it's all code, it's all, we got a lot of shit about how he deserves it, and he's actually writing literature, and, none of these prizes are objective. None of those people sitting on that panel in wherever, Stockholm or wherever the hell they are sitting there. They're thinking, well, what can we do to get the biggest, plug for the Nobel Prize? But, Bob Dylan's oeuvre, if you want to call it that, is certainly not, better than a lot of living writers today, and there are a lot of writers who have recently died who should have gotten this too. And this, the people that, of course, almost every troll that we have heard from is, guess what? A white male. Because it's sort of like, or some women actually too. One woman got really mad at me. She thought I was better than that.
Oh, yeah.
And also the leaps in logic too of, I say in my statement, of course he's gotten the accolades, he's deserving of them, but not this one. And of course the leaps in logic are, I hate Bob Dylan and I don't like his music. I'm not familiar with his music. I'm of course speaking without having ever listened to anything. And also,
you hate Jesus.
Yeah. I don't recognize the bardic tradition in poetry, even though I've studied poetry for half my life. It's just there's just so much code, and my question to them is just look who's been left out. Look at all of the writers who have written so many amazing books, because of what they're writing about, their voices, the things they write about. Bob Dylan sold out a long time ago. I'm sorry, he doesn't deserve this. He hasn't challenged the status quo.
And interestingly, this man who attacked both of us, his final words to both of us was an angry line about Toni Morrison,
Right.
who was the last American Nobel laureate. So his punch at the very end had to be attacking a woman. He said something Toni Morrison, BFD. I had to look that up in Urban Dictionary. You can look that up. I don't want to say it, but no, it's a different thing.
Oh.
But isn't this the same guy who then followed up again and explained that he too is an aspiring writer along the lines of Faulkner and Dostoevsky, not just any writer, and maybe Purchase would like to help him sometime
This is
with
always
his work.
goes to, then
And
they
that
look you
speaks
up.
to the tradition. That speaks to that club that George Carlin talked about.
Yeah.
We don't have to talk to know that we have like interests, and that this is what we're perpetuating. White male interests are what's going on, and it doesn't allow for writers of color to be seen as having legitimate voices, legitimate stories that the culture that everyone should be listening to. I'm sorry.
No, the response that I had was, if I knew anything at all about literature, I would understand that Bob Dylan was a genius. And I was like, well, okay, but maybe he shouldn't get the Nobel Prize. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you about Bob Dylan being a genius. I do know something about literature. But I think it raises, I think you're right that it raises a larger question, because every time you legitimize someone with the Nobel Prize in literature, in a sense, you're also delegitimizing other voices at the same time. And whether, you know, you're a person who would be an advocate for Don DeLillo having won that award, or Ngugi, you know, those voices are muted then, and although there are exceptions, most of the awards still, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the major awards go to men, and primarily to white men at every single level. And I remember several years back, there was a great disconsternation about the fact that all of the finalists for the National Book Award were women. Does anyone else remember that year? Kate Walbert and Lily Tuck and I can't remember who else. But so Alex G said recently that he was getting tired of talking about the topics he was always asked to talk about, to represent people of color. And Marlon James recently posted that he was not going to be on the diversity panel anymore. Let white people be on the diversity panel. Because he's tired of talking about it, and he's not the one that has to change. But here we are, all four of you, sitting here on a panel about sexism, and we're all women. And so I wonder, what can we do to change things, what is already happening to change things, and how do we have to engage with others in order to change things?
Well, I read the Marlon James article this week, and I thought, oh, great, I'm on a panel about Starlings. No, but I don't know. I mean, again, I do my own kind of code switching from my work that I did before, and I think I tried to shut the door on that because I needed to immerse myself and all of this in this world. But I've actually found so much solace and lessons from that because change is so glacial. And
Except for the glaciers.
this is true. I think they just like from outer space. But yeah, no, I think that I try not to talk about things in binary. So it's like, no, we can't talk about this anymore. Now, you know. But I think that when I've seen certain issues and how they've kind of gone through their ups and downs, I think there's a time for talk, and then there's a time for action, and then there's a time for more talk, and there's a time for more action. It goes through these cycles of refinement, and I think treating it like it's an endpoint is part of the problem. Whether it's the diversity conversation, the sexism conversation, is that we have such a far way to go, and it's going to need to be more nuanced and refined and so forth. So to me, I think that I completely understand, Marlon James, frustration in that I think that we've had sufficient amount of talk in order to engender more action at which time. And so one thing that's been very both frustrating, but eventually I had to realize that it's very telling, is the general lack of data, in the field. Like, to me, the fact that a data has to exist, to do these counts, that should actually be done by, the industries themselves should, other industries count things. They really count a lot, and I know these industries do too. I think it's a matter of what is made public and what is shared. So this idea that it's this cottage industry is very perplexing to me, having come from, small organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, I know Marlon and Alex well, and I do disagree with this, and I've thought of their words for a long time. I'm familiar with the sentiment in a big way. I do notice often this declaration comes after people have become a little successful. People never say this when they're struggling, but I don't think we're there yet. I mean, Vita hasn't even been around that long. Most of these a lot of this stuff has, I mean, I felt like it was happening in the 90s, but then it stopped. I felt like 9/11 happened in the 2000s were just heinous, and there was no, social justice anywhere, it felt like, for a decade at least. And so I don't think we're really there yet that we can abandon it. And I think there's the service part of my job is so minuscule anyways, at least my job as an artist, that why not? I will keep talking about it forever. People can count on me to keep going. It's exhausting, of course it's exhausting. But anytime if you've done any activist work or, it's exhausting and no one does it because it's pleasurable. But then there's other tactics too. I mean, I really do, like this guy who harassed us too, like now I'm very public with people's names. If you harass me, people will know you. They will know you. They will know exactly where to find you. Any information about you that's out there, I will make it public. I want you to find me dangerous in that way. I'm not here to make you feel safe. If you disrespect me, I will find a very intense way to disrespect you. So that's become part of my MO. I encourage my students even to think like this. I'm not gonna be the bigger person always. I don't really believe that this thing that we called the bigger person was ever the bigger person. It's very convenient to tell people to be like that. And so I also now see like a lot of, there'll be prizes or even job interviews where people will assemble lots of women of color or people of color or people with all sorts of backgrounds, so it'll appear very diverse, but they already know that the white guy is going to win that. So that makes them feel better. So I'm not trying to sound like Trump thinks it's all rigged, but there is a way in which we know, oh, this guy is going to win. But look, they look good because they have this panel put together. I almost know the minute I get called for a job interview, I'm not going to get this thing. It's just so they can check off the box that it was a woman of color that we interviewed as a finalist, But then, it was also funny, I did a New York Times book review a few years ago. There was the cover of the New York Times book review, and I was very excited because it was like me, a woman of color, reviewing a woman of color. The cover of the New York Times book review was Helena Miami's Boys No Bird, and I was very happy online. And then Michael Wolff, I don't know if anyone knows, I'm happy to say his name, is a sort of marginal Vanity Fair something or another, I don't know. But he's a joke, you can read about him. He's an online troll, and I didn't know him at that time. And he decided to just talk about how I had, does anyone know how to read this first paragraph? Because I don't understand it. And then started making references to my foreign name and wondered if I spoke English properly. And so I saw this happen, and then I just jumped in and I said, I'm not going to sit back. And so the only way that I was able to demolish him after many hours was by using the language of sexual harassment. And I called him honey, sweetie, baby, you didn't understand, let me help you. What words did you have trouble? And it's easy, I mean, I used humor in my own work, so it wasn't like a huge stretch, but I had to humiliate him, and in the end he said, sorry. Whoa, okay, I'm done.
Yeah.
And,
Humor is a good tactic. Shame is a good tactic too. And I mean, it's been part of what Vita has accomplished. I mean, it's publicly, in a way, shame those who can be shamed. I have to say, though, that there seems to be a contingent that cannot be shamed by this statistics.
There's that, and there's also, I mean, I've been like living in the shadow of, what I just shared the tiniest bit of tonight, and I don't feel, and I'm not attributing this to Vita or the work that Vita's doing, which I think is so important and I would like to help with, but I don't feel safe anywhere. And not even with Vita. In fact, I was on Facebook when the women with the binders full of women thing was happening, and all these women started joining and tagging each other, and it was like all these women coming together, and I saw all these women whose letters I knew were in the box and that, and I was like, this is not safe either. It's all, and they're all allies with this guy because he can help them out, and there's no safe place. I know this makes me sound like Trump, but I would just like to put up a wall. What do we do to make those places feel safer? And I mean, I think I'm in a bit of an unusual situation because I sat next to that box full of letters from, I mean, if I started listing the names of these women, the planet would crack in half. Nothing feels safe. Vita doesn't feel safe. I don't want it. Does Vita go to AWP? I'm not going to AWP ever. Hell no, no way. So what is the space outside of all of this that is safe?
I want to respond to your original question just to build on. I'll take my Vita hat off for a second and just speak about my own experiences in terms of what I do on a personal level is One of my heroes is James Baldwin, and one of the things he said in The Fire Next Time is that it's going to take the relatively conscious black people and the relatively conscious white people, and you can expand that to writers of color, et cetera, to come together and talk and foment some sort of vision for what is that, and create something else. What it is, I don't have the brain capacity to envision it, and nor would I presume to. I think it's got to somehow sort of come together accidentally through relationships, because as we know, the system that we refer to is not some objective thing. It's made up of individuals that learn bias and repeat it in ways that are not as recognizable. I don't believe in progress with we're always going forward. I believe in the, 2 steps forward, 2.5 steps back, or 1 step back, or whatever. So on a personal level for me, it's always about, coming together on panels, forming relationships, learning how to listen to people who are not in my demographic. Particularly for me, it's writers of colors, because I grew up in a background that made me acutely aware of, or I became acutely aware of my own. I mean, I am the product of the Trump generation, the Trump milieu, I guess you could say. I grew up in the deep South with a family that was very racist, and so that required a lot of self-examination. And I fully believe that everybody makes choices at a certain point in life. I tell my students this all the time. You've inherited your values, and at a certain point you are going to decide, is this what I really believe, or are my experiences showing me differently? I'm going to choose. And a lot of that is tied into family, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things I always believe in is that we need to listen to people who are not in our demographic. We need to trust them when someone like Marlon James, even if he has reached a certain point and says he's fatigued, respect that. Because I know I get fatigued talking about sexism and, homophobia and things like that. So I try to listen, and I try to learn, and I try to respect, even when something makes me feel, white guilt, and I always say white guilt is something that's just about you putting yourself first. That's not about really what's going on in these transactions, or these interactions, I should say. So on the one hand, respecting people who are doing the work, who are in the demographics that are oppressed, listening, and stepping aside, shutting up, even though I'm not shutting up very much here. And then also the other thing I think that needs to happen for individuals, and I tell my students this a lot too, who are doing the work, is that you need to be healthy yourself. So when you feel yourself getting worn out, frustrated, you can't help other people if you're not healthy. Step aside, make a cocoon, whatever, and recover. And that's really hard, I think, for a lot of writers of color who are being, can you come be on, can you come read, we need to fill our quotas, even though that's not what's being said. And so there needs to come a point where you say, you know what, I'm exhausted. You find and this is, I think, where James is coming from a little bit. So put my Vita hat back on. The other thing I believe is that if we're going to talk about community, and we're going to talk about fomenting these relationships, not just learning how to stop arguing, but also learning how to support each other in ways that we're capable of, whether that's, retweeting things that have nothing to do with your experiences, publishing, that's why I volunteer at Vita, publishing voices that need to be heard, that I think are historically suppressed or ignored or shut down or whatever. And these are all things we're doing without money. I mean, we're just, we get donations now to support the platforms and that sort of thing, but, this is where I choose to, I used to be an activist, on the ground activist, but now I want to, armchair activist and a classroom activist. That's where I do my, but I believe I can spend a few hours every week working on, developing, there's so much free stuff on the internet that you can do. You're just a WordPress website. So anyway, that's what I come from.
So we have a few minutes to take a few questions from the audience, and I'd appreciate it if you ask questions, or if you have a statement to make, to have it be short and link it to a question. Yeah. So does anyone? Yeah.
There's an interview with Bonnie in February where they pointed out that in your novel you make a point to say this is a white family, or you describe your characters as being white, as kind of, which is interesting because usually you just
didn't hear it.
What?
I didn't hear it.
The
Sorry.
question is really whether the writers on the panel, when they're writing outside of their gender, outside of their race, when they're writing someone very different from them, how they manage that, how they feel about it, how they negotiate that terrain, and so.
I'm not sure if there's any confusion about this, but there might be. So I just want to make totally clear that I'm a white person, in case there were any question marks about it. And so when I was writing a white story and calling it out as white, it was as a white person, and I felt like that was a really important part of the particular American mythology that I was taking apart. And, I've definitely been mistaken for almost every race in the book, and I do have a Z in my name, but as far as I know, I'm white.
Right. Anyone else want to react to that?
Well, I look like a white person to many people, but I am not. I was raised, some Iranians will call themselves white, but I don't. I was raised very proudly brown by my father at a very young age. But I write a lot of Iranian characters, so that's in both my realist work and fabulous work and my journals, and I often talk about that too. In fact, today this came up in a lecture with students, and I said, people of color will also assume it's a white family when you don't specify. We've internalized it that much that people of color will always assume a character's white too. Because we are reading the Western canon, which is largely literature by men, about men, for men. I mean, that's the history of it, right? So this is the literature we have. So, it's a big issue. I mean, I don't know if I have been better about thinking about those things, maybe because my world isn't the white world. But for me, I also talk to this in lectures, that for me the white world is just as exotic as some of you guys might find the Eastern world. So I find when I read Cheever, Yeats, or Salter, and stories about martinis and adultery and ladies clutching their pearls, you're very exotic to me. I see you ladies in the Upper East Side, and I gawk at you. I fetishize it. My friend used to say I was an Occidentalist. I find you very, very exotic. So that's the thing. It depends on perspective, you see.
Yeah, tell me about it. Pearls?
I dated a woman on the Upper West Side once, and I was like, what is this place?
Other questions? Yeah.
I was just curious, about, I like how you opened with this story that really addresses the intersection between the personal and the political. And we've talked a lot about stuff that we can do in the political sphere and in the public sphere to make change. But I wanted to ask the panelists about what can be done in the personal sphere to create change and create a safer world in that sphere.
What can be done in the personal sphere
In the personal
to
sphere.
create a safer sphere? I mean,
Well, in personal relationships.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the lines, more than in any other sector, I feel like in the literary world, the line between personal and private private and public are blurred.
Yeah.
So what is a workshop space? Is that you're there sharing your personal writing, and then you're hanging out and drinking afterwards, and probably before too. So maybe that was just my experience. So it gets very, where I had come from, I was like, okay, this is a conference, and this is it was not like that. So, I mean, in my piece, like, I talk about, to go from that personal kind of, thing to sit in a classroom and have people act in a very strange way, to suddenly not be able to understand you, and to understand what you're writing is a very strange thing, and to ask certain questions of you that are not being asked of other people. That's where it becomes very a personal thing is literally to if it is in the beginning, like anything that you do for the first time is a bit awkward. It's a muscle that you haven't been using. So whether it's that you're looking at a piece and you don't see race interrogated and you think it should be, be the person that speaks up, so that if there is just one person of color in that room, they're not the person who has to, you know, bring that up. That goes such a long way. I mean, I think that the silence is amazing and really deafening and really makes you feel alone. So that's
I'll just
one.
add one thing about that too. If something doesn't feel okay, I would think you should check in with several people who you feel you can trust, because as we saw with the recent Trump thing, the journalist who he cornered in the mansion and all that, it wasn't that her story came out. Now the media is treating it as legit because she actually told other people, and that's what's making it legit. I mean, you know, but go figure. So checking in, and I agree with Tori, like being the white person who says, I don't want to fatigue all the writers of color in the room. I'm going to point this out. This has got nothing but white people in it. It means so much, and not looking to the person of color. Can you back me up on this? Like, don't expect that too.
Yeah.
I feel like, in general, privacy protects and secrets hurt. And personally, I'm willing to forego some of the former for the sake of the latter, although it's taken me a while to get to this space, obviously. But on another personal level, the literary community is generally, and this, you know, may or may not be something like PTSD, toxic to me. And I really don't want to have much to do with it. And that feels like a personally responsible decision to pursue a different kind of career. And I'm undecided. I mean, I don't know if that would be a case of me like rolling over and being, you know, like bowing out in a way, in like the sort of attitude that has helped to create this situation in the first place, or if it's, you know, like setting a boundary. And, you know, the clock is ticking. My life is running out. I don't have time for toxic people and environments. There are people I love. There are things that are worth my time and energy, and there are things that aren't.
I think what makes that so difficult, I think, and so difficult with choices, what Kavita was saying about you're operating in an environment where there is the illusion of intimacy. And so therefore it makes those lines much more difficult to negotiate. Portuguese, I interrupt.
No, I was just going to say, like, you know, with Bonnie, what I would say to her, and if you guys are feeling that way too, is that one thing I found hardening in teaching is that I do think there's a change in generation. Like now I'm a full generation older than my students, so I could be their mother. And I do see more progressive, for instance, young men. I'm amazed. I look at these young men and I think, oh my God, I like suddenly love men when I'm among my male students. It's amazing to me, and I see their attitudes and their writing and all that, and they're so much more progressive than the Gen X men of my generation, who locker room talk was a constant. I was a tomboy, I hung out with guys all the time, and it was just a non-stop. It's very deeply ingrained in me, the way they would speak about women. And that there is this generation of men who I do believe actually are feminists and are willing to take the responsibility for rape and issues surrounding rape culture, and they realize it's a male issue. I'm really hardened by that, so I'm waiting for them to empower them and let them get empowered, because I think better things will happen. Not just the men, of course, the women too. I mean, I'm in love with my students and how they think and their ethics.
I'm wondering out to them, the men, aren't threatened.
Exactly.
Like you just said something really feminist, and you're like, fine, right?
Yeah, totally.
But I'm wondering if I'm aligning a little bit emotionally with Marlon James in one way, but from a female perspective. Like, go ahead, do your work. I don't give a fuck what you do. I'm gonna sit in my house and write a story if I wanna write a story. I don't care if you publish it, I don't care what you think of it. It's toxic, it's horrible. I love language. Have fun fighting this out, duking this out on your own. Goodbye. Why should I stay engaged? Why should Marlon stay engaged?
And I think that's healthy. You know what boundaries you need to set for yourself. We don't all have to do the same thing.
Hi, are there certain things that you've been surprised by the difference of reaction to what you've written by male readers and female readers? I mean, if you could generalize.
Everyone's laughing.
I want to know. I mean, I've had my own experiences, so I want to know.
Well, I'll just say that for, I don't know the male-female breakdown, but, you know, going back to that whole thing of this kind of undergroundish thing, I was surprised to have some women friends approach me online or parsing that they can't like it or share it because, it'll, rock their boat and I was like, okay, yeah, you do what you need to do. But it was just really interesting to me because it was perfect evidence that, this free thinking and we're allowed to like do and, in this, community of ideas, it really shows the power, differential and how, and these were kick-ass women, quite honestly. So it was very,
I think it's sad too because it's not surprising to me these reactions, and I think a lot of the underlying sentiment is that, well, that's really got nothing to do with me. That's not my experience, so why do I need to share that?
yeah.
This idea that I have to relate. I mean, this is one thing I can't stand about my students. I don't really relate to them. It's because literature must be a mirror for you.
Yeah. Poor Teresa, have you had
yeah.
a response that's very different from men as
yeah.
compared to women to your writing?
For a specific reason is that both my books and most of my short stories I write from the perspective of men. That's always been the case for me, and I've given long interviews about it. It's a subject of fascination for people, how a mostly straight woman could write, chooses to write from a male perspective, and so what this does to men is but it's easy also to Google me and to realize that I'm unmarried with no children. So okay, this is not somebody, not a wife box, not a mother box. Aha, a woman who's interested in me, understands me. In fact, she writes about tragic men, even fallen men. Oh, great. So then I become a subject of fascination for them. So I get lengthy letters from men from all around the world who think I'm the one that understands them. And I'm the one that should be with them. And all this stuff. Here, I have more material for you to write about. And it's like, whoa. So I have really not enjoyed that at all. Or because I write about 9/11 conspiracy theorists, always men, want to cozy up to me, and I'm like, no, I watched it out my window, don't believe it was an inside job. All these things, so I have, my big problem is my male readers, never my female readers. I've never had a problem with I have had one stalker that was a woman, and she's schizophrenic, and that was an issue, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think, do we have time for one more, Rosie?
Sure.
Yeah?
Just one more. I'll try to boil it down. I just want to thank you all for the amazing contributions. And I have so many questions, but I'm coming from the perspective of a translator. So I'm wondering, to just condense it, if the panelists have any witty responses when people say, oh, you shouldn't set quotas, or the internalized, when other women have internalized the sexism, and they say, oh, well, we're choosing books based on aesthetics, and the aesthetics that we happen to like and publish just happen to all be written by men, or these other countries are presenting their best books to us, and, we point out that they're all men, or 90% men, knowing that the population of that country is not 90% men. I don't know, just how you handle these.
I can't be witty on command, but I can say that I'm really tired of the responding to all these things that are supposed to be about objectivity and you can't do quotas. I'm just like, what's wrong with a quota? We have quotas that are unspoken all the time. What was it? Ruth Bader Ginsburg recently said, what happened? How many women on the Supreme Court will be enough? Well, 9. And she's like, it was 9 men. What's wrong with that? So I just posted an article today that talks about how it's better off. Women are really in good situation in Iceland because basically like 1/5 of them went out on the streets and protest of like, look at all the jobs that we do, and then they all like over a couple of years elected a lot of women into higher positions. And now they actually have quotas, I guess, in some capacity. I can't remember what it said. You have to look it up. But I posted it. I was like, "What's wrong with a quota?
Yeah.
We've had male quotas for so long. What's wrong with it? I'm sorry you don't like it, but let's change it. Until we don't need quotas."
Yeah, obviously the system needs it, so that makes sense. I mean, yeah, I also. I don't know how witty I can be, but honestly, I judge prizes all the time. I've done it for Penn, I've done it for the Berlin Prize, I was on the Neustadt jury, I'm on many of these juries. And it's very funny for me to hear these, because I'm familiar with what you're talking about, and I know these ideas, but from my objective experience, if you want to hear objectivity, my objective belief, and everyone can challenge me and fight me after this, I have consistently seen the quality of work be better by women. I mean that 100%. I will go to the death on this topic. I can simply, I can provide, I should just do some weird, crazy, pseudoscientific, thing, but I just think that I don't even know where it comes from, because women, to me, have demonstrated clearly they're better intellectuals, greater thinkers, greater artists. I just don't know what area they're lacking. So until I'm faced with that, then I'm gonna help.
And that's part two of the quota question. Why not quotas? Because there are writers of color, there are women who are writing quality work. You know, this idea that we're gonna do a quota, which means it's gonna be of lesser value, that's the implication. And it's just bullshit. It's just saying, let's give writers a chance who have been historically left out.
I mean, it wasn't gender specific, but I wrote a piece for The Atlantic last year that was debunking the whole romanticization of rejection, which is kind of keep trying, and I kind of was like, F that. And let's just, talk about that this kind of notion of objectivity, but underneath it, you look at the systemic nature of things. So I threw, from my previous life, I was like, okay, I'll throw in all the stats, and I'll quote Chimamanda, and her, because it's also a harm. We've talked a lot about what it does to the writers, but it actually is really, shortchanging the reader, because I think it really doesn't give them credit for wanting more, and wanting, and their curiosity, which is the fuel, really. So to me, and then I took the noxious comments, I know I shouldn't have read them, but I read them, and I turned them into a McSweeney's, open letter to editors about rejection. So, I don't know if that's witty, but it was definitely therapeutic.
Yeah, we can't let him go, he's good.
Okay, please join me in thanking our amazing panel.